cloudy. There's a severe lack of sun, but it's kind of coming through clouds are curtains in a way, clouds are sun curtains. If you're new here, hello, my name is Dakota and I talk about books mostly, but I also talk about writing and art, and I mean they're all kind of synonymous, aren't they? That's my area of interest. And if you're not new here, hello, how are you? I missed you. I have a treat for you today, and I'm gonna try and keep doing this every single month, and it's as simple as telling you what I read every month. It's just a monthly reading wrap up. Here are the books that I read in January, but I don't do that because I try and think outside the box, but sometimes at the end of the day you guys just want to know what I'm reading. So here is every single book I read in January and why I read it and what it's about and what I thought of it. I read, how many books are here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 books, and none of them are particularly huge. So before you say, how do you read 8 books in a month? That's only 2 a week and they're not that big. And it's my job to read books and tell you about them, so don't compare your reading amount to mine. If you read half a book this month, brilliant. I am so proud of you for reading. There is definitely a story to the order of books that I read. I am 100% a mood reader. I have a very big list of books that I want to read, but I can't tell myself what to read and when, because then I just won't be into it, and I kind of sabotage the book. If I pick up a book that I don't want to read in that moment, I'll be resentful towards the book, and the book will therefore, in my eyes, be less brilliant because I'm kind of reading it reluctantly and with this weird kind of resentment. Am I too much? But when I mood read and when I intuitively read, I just kind of go through my list and pluck what I feel in the moment, and I go on this spiral, and it supplements my interest and it feeds into what I'm currently doing and it informs my current projects. And so that's what mood reading is for me. So here is my monthly reading wrap up for January as a chronic mood reader. If you've watched my other videos, you'll know that I'm currently going through a memoir slash biography slash autobiography phase. It's not a phase, I think it's gonna stay. I think my taste is just evolving with my interests and my projects and whatnot. So most of these are in fact autobiographies, biographies and memoirs, but it tells a story. It's people that tell a story. I'm just gonna get into it. Let's just talk about the books that I read. I need to flip this upside down so it's in order. Exactly like that. Okay, the first book that I read this year in January is The Lonely City by Olivia Lang. And see, this is half a lie because I half read it in December and finished it in January. The very first day of January, if you will. But I'm gonna count it because this is crucial to the story behind the order of books that I've read. This book is a collection of essays moving fluidly between the works and lives of some of New York City's most compelling artists. And I really like the way that Olivia Lang kind of details these dazzling investigations of what it means to be an artist and the solitude that kind of comes with that. And there's a lot of great, interesting people that I was introduced to via this book. For example, Klaus Nomi. I didn't know who that was, and then I read about him and now I am in awe of him. He's absolutely brilliant. Look him up, Klaus Nomi. He is a 80s icon. He was an opera trained singer, and there's just no one like him. He was a backup singer for David Bowie for a show, and that's what he's known for a lot, but he also had this whole separate career, and it's absolutely incredible and very big inspiration for just being unapologetically and so authentically yourself and the art that you want to be, and not just creating the art but being the art. I got really inspired by Klaus Nomi in particular. There are a lot of things that I highlighted and dog-eared the pages in this book, which is a great sign, because when I annotate a lot it means that I am actively really involved and want to absorb the information that the book is giving me. This was also recommended to me by a friend, but I was so adamantly against it because the way that she tried to sell it to me, bless you Kyla, I love you Kyla, the way that she tried to sell it to me was, oh, there's a whole chapter on Andy Warhol, you have to read about Andy Warhol. And prior to this book, I don't say hate a lot, but I hated Andy Warhol. But that's also just because, you know, I heard about the way that he treated Edie Sedgwick and what happened to her, and had the artist and the muse and that whole discourse, and I just had this vendetta against him without knowing all too much. And so I finally found this book at a thrift store and read it semi-reluctantly and fell in love with it. And I wouldn't say fell in love with Andy Warhol because he's a tricky little guy, but I have a newfound interest not just for him, but that whole world that surrounded him. The art scene of the 60s and the newness. Newness? Is newness a word? It's interesting how it almost feels like in our current time, 2024, it feels like everything's been done and we're just doing these loops, you know, we're just going back around, whether it's fashion or art or music, we're just doing loops. But in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and whatnot, it was all kind of uncharted territory and it was exciting, and things like television and whatnot were advancing, and that's so incredible. And how fun is that? And it makes me so excited and interested to see how we're going to continue with this forward in our time and our lives, because I don't know about you, but I haven't seen anything new for a while. I mean, yeah, sure, AI and everything is happening and they're trying to make that the new art movement, like AI art. And what's it called? What's those little people, you can sell the AI art for, there's like a massive thing about it, it's not Bitcoin, it's like the Bitcoin art adjacent thing, whatever it's called, I don't know. I don't like it, I'm not for it. I think it's grossly unethical. And so I haven't seen any creative movement that's new for a while, so I'm just, you know, I'm excited for it. I hope that it's possible. It is possible, but I just hope that we see one soon, wherever do. I know I'm going on a whole tangent right now, but it has got me thinking. It is morning, and in the mornings my brain is grossly active. My brain turns off at about 4 p.m. and doesn't turn on again until the next morning, but it has got me thinking about recent art movements that I've really enjoyed. But by recent I mean in my adult years, like the past few years, but I just can't think of any. It all feels like rapid trends, and I wonder if that's because of short form content and the perpetualizing of this rapid short-term aesthetic cycles and these trend cycles and whatnot, and these massive kind of identity. It's an identity crisis for our generation in particular, because we're exposed to all this content that's like, brand yourself, this is who you have to be, brand yourself and stick to it, whether it's a label or an aesthetic or a niche or an interest. You choose them now and you make that your personality. I feel like that's forced on us more than ever because of the content that we consume. And I think that that greatly, whilst it inspires people in particular ways, I think it also greatly inhibits individuality and individual thinking and the desire to create something new and original and individual. I'm cutting my tangent off there for the sake of not chatting for an hour straight and having to edit this later and hate myself for it. But before we jump into the next books, I want to have a quick sponsor break to talk about this video's wonderful sponsor, and you know who it is, Squarespace. If you are a writer or artist of any medium, which I bet you are because you're a part of my community, I am launching a literary and arts journal / not so secret cult via Squarespace, where I provide a monthly prompt and you can create something based on that prompt and submit it, and I curate a lovely little world of art for you and others to consume. I crafted / am still crafting this platform myself, and it is quite involved, but luckily for me I'm partnering with Squarespace to bring it to you. Squarespace just makes the whole process of building a website so seamless and, dare I say, enjoyable. And I love Squarespace for turning passion projects into professional projects and morphing dreams and concepts into tangible realities. And this is just done so simply by the fluid engine design system and elements that I can eventually play with, like email campaigns and an online store. You can check out the collective at nowheregirlcollective.com and make yourself familiar until submissions open, and in the meantime you can head to squarespace.com/Dakota Warren for 10% off your first purchase if you want to build your own website or passion project too. The next book that I read, this is Paul Merchant's Bone from a Stag's Heart. I have not heard of this, and I think it's from a small indie press, but it was nominated for the Poetry Book Society recommendation. And so I picked this up. I actually didn't really read the blurb or flick through it. I just saw that it was recommended by the Poetry Society and thought, brilliant, this will do. This is an interesting play on various histories such as Roman, Celtic, Chinese, American West, Native American, and European. And so it's a bunch of short poems that make up longer poems on this kind of culture and religion and history, which is really interesting. But then I also found that because it kept on going between various of the above, I couldn't keep up with which culture it was who would say some myth or something, and I'd be like, okay, are we still talking Celtic? Where are we drawing this one from? It was interesting because it felt very, what's the word? Alchemical? It felt very alchemical. It felt very much like I was reading magic, but not in a way that I would usually say. I mean it more in a literal sense. It feels like you're reading spells. I think that's the best way that I can describe it, but I also want to say that I didn't connect with it that much because it didn't feel very emotional for me. It felt more so just describing these little parts of history in more of a factual way than an emotional way. Maybe that's just because I am not part of that history and couldn't put myself in them. So that's this book. I hope I explained that well, and I hope I didn't butcher it because it is lovely writing. I just didn't connect with it. Take that. The next book I started reading in December but finished in January again, so I'm counting it as a January read. And this is Billie Holiday's Lady Sings the Blues. This is her memoir. This book was introduced to me via this book, but I already had this book, but this book mentioned it. And so I thought, well, now it's time to read this book. I'm telling you, this book is the seeds that started all my books this month. It's like I need to have a diagram on the walls, and this book relates to this book, and this book relates to this book. Anyway, I read this because this book was published in 1958, and unfortunately, Billie Holiday died in 1959. And there is this horrible, gut-wrenching link. This is an incredible memoir, by the way. It's so, she tells it as it is. She details her childhood, she details her teen years, she details her adult years, she details her troubles with the law, she details her drug addiction, she details everyone she's ever met, she details the struggles that she faced being a black woman in America trying to make it as a singer, and the racism that was inherently a part of the 50s. It's an incredible, incredible, incredible memoir, and I could not recommend this enough. In fact, I've already given it to 2 friends to read. There's this portion where she talks about her father's death and how because he was a black man in America, the hospital wouldn't take care of him. They said, well, he's basically dead, so just let him die. And then the next year after this book was published, the same thing happened to Billie Holiday. She overdosed on drugs. She was taken to the hospital, and because she was a black woman, the hospital said, well, she's just another junkie, let her die. Just absolutely horrible and so heartbreaking, and just the link is just absolutely gut-wrenching. But this is, I can't recommend this enough as a memoir. This is such a incredible look into the life of jazz in the 50s. It has all these incredible links with these incredible artists like Louis Armstrong, like Duke Ellington, all these amazing, amazing artists that she's just talking about. Please read this if you're into any memoirs. If you like jazz, if you've heard of Billie Holiday, look up her music and read this book because it is like no other. I'm telling you. The next book that I read also stems from this book and that is Andy Warhol and Pat Hackett's Popism, and this is a recount of pop in the 60s from Andy Warhol's perspective. And I'm pretty sure Pat Hackett used to, so Andy would say everything and Pat Hackett would write it all down, and then she would curate these books for him because he was very much, he just liked to yap. Andy Warhol was a yapper. He would yap and yap and yap, and Pat Hackett would loyally just write everything down and transcribe, and he'd give her all his tape recordings and she'd transcribe it and whatnot. So we have her to thank for all these ramblings of Andy Warhol. Now I read this because A, research, and I can't say for what project, but also because I was interested, I'm really interested in the art scene of the 60s. I'm just so fascinated with the 60s in general. It seems like such a tumultuous time. I'd had to do some research for my project, and specifically in America, it was everywhere. This feeling of general civil unrest was everywhere between the 50s and the 70s, and it was this political upheaval, you know, with everything like Vietnam War and things like the Cold War and just all the assassinations going on, and everybody was suddenly thinking conspiracy theories and everybody was suddenly suspicious of everyone. One example of this in the 60s was in 1967, maybe 1968, I think it was the end of 67. In 1967, the Australian Prime Minister at the time, Harold Holt, went for a swim and never came back. This has been an Australian classic story. It's a bit of a mystery. No one knows if he got swept out to sea or if it was shark dinner or if it was assassinated or taken somewhere or something. But at the time when it happened, in the late 60s, everybody went crazy with conspiracies because the general political unrest was so great. Everybody thought that he was a spy from the Chinese Communist Party and that they'd come in his submarine and picked him up. And all these kinds of things. It was insane. But it wasn't insane at the time because that's what they were thinking and feeling because of all the insane things that were happening. Anyway, I keep on going on tangents. I hope this is fun. But the art movement that emerged from the 60s in spite of this was absolutely incredible, and I hated pop before I read this book. Hated it. Hated it, hated it, hated it. And I'm saying hate with a capital H. Hated pop. Now I love pop. Because it stands for so much more than what it is. It's a rebellion. It's an active rebellion. It's like the absurdism of art. In a way. Probably not. There's going to be someone in comments saying, you're an idiot. Arrest me, officer. I'm an idiot. I think that some of you guys forget that I'm just a girl sat in my bedroom chatting. I'm just yapping. I liked this book. It was very good, very fun, lots of information in it. There's pictures and everything, and it goes through all the iconic people of the 60s New York art scene. The most important thing to remember though is when it's written from Andy Warhol's first person narration, it's not completely non-fiction. He loved to embellish, he loved to lie. Notoriously, he would give all these different media sources, different stories about himself. He used to have this thing where he'd like to track how people got information about him, so he'd tell a bunch of different news sources a different autobiography, and then when someone that he met said, oh, you're from blah blah blah, right? He would know how they'd learned about him, and so he loved to lie, which I respect. Bring back lying, normalize lying. So this book you can't trust anything written by him because he loves to yap, he loves to fib, but I must commend that he does make it entertaining. So this was a really fun read and a really fun glimpse into the pop scene of the 60s at the time. The next book that I read, this was a reread, and I read this because I saw on Instagram a quote from this book and I got FOMO, and I've already read this book but I wanted to reread it. I've spoken about this on my channel before. I think it was one of my top reads of 2021. This is A Room of One's Own by, can you even see? Yeah. This is A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, and this is a collection of essays from Virginia Woolf on what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a writer and all these struggles faced back then and still relevant of being a female artist in a man's world. I was saying to Jack when I read this, because we were in a little cabin in the countryside when I was reading this, when the first time that I read this I was absolutely bewitched. I'd never read anything like it. I was obsessed, but I think that this book was my introduction to feminist literature. But since then I've read a lot more books about being an artist as a woman and whatnot, and so I think that rereading this, it felt almost like, yeah, I've heard of all of this before. It's still a profound book, don't get me wrong, but the second time reading it I felt almost let down because I held it to such a high standard in my head that it's the best book ever written on being an artist and a female. But it's just one of the books written about being an artist and a female. It's still good, don't get me wrong. I just think that I shouldn't have reread it and I should have kept it as that magical little capsule in my head. The next book that I read, and now this one stems from this one. So in this, that's Edie Sedgwick, that's Andy Warhol, that's Edie Sedgwick. Edie Sedgwick was his muse for a while. He dumped her, she died. Horrible. Horrible. And so I wanted to read her perspective. And this is her biography. It's not an autobiography and it's not a memoir because unfortunately she passed. And so this is a collection of people who knew her detailing her life. I really appreciate that because I love memoirs and I love autobiographies. I love when people are telling you about their life and they know everything because they're letting you in on all these little things that they've experienced. But biographies can seem quite factual and quite monotonous and then she went to school and then she graduated and then she went to university and then she graduated and then she got a job and then she moved to New York. This is done in a way that makes it feel like you're there with Edie because it's a collection of people that know her giving quotes about her, and so it feels like you're there. It's the closest we can get to feeling like we're there with her. Again, this details what life was like in the 60s in America. Edie comes from a very aristocratic family. She ran away to New York. She was a socialite. Everybody was enamored. She was bewitching everyone that she walked past. Everybody knew of her, everybody loved her. And then she got involved with drugs, as was so prevalent of the 60s scene. And it was just downhill from there. And she got introduced to drugs at Andy Warhol's factory, which is not good. There are so many interesting anecdotes in this book. There's this one particular thing. There was this, they called them acid doctors. And they would inject you, they would give you shots that were meant to be vitamins and all these magical, wonderful things that would make you feel great for days, but it was just amphetamines. They just shot you with amphetamines, and then you'd get addicted to amphetamines, but you'd need to come back 3 times a day for new shots because you'd be on withdrawals, and then basically all of New York was addicted to amphetamines because the doctors were shooting them up with it. Read about it, it's really interesting. The next book that I read is Closer by Dennis Cooper, and I read this purely because I liked the cover, so I picked it up, and then I read the blurb and I liked the blurb, but it was on one of those recommended tables at a bookstore in London, and I'm such an enthusiast for what bookstores and booksellers recommend because they know their stock, they know what their people like. And this was on the recommended table for queer literature, I believe, and so I picked it up, and I don't know what I was expecting. This is insane. The blurb is, physically beautiful and strangely passive, George Miles attracts his fellow students' attention like a wallet lying on the street. One after another, his teenage friends rifle through George, ransacking him for love, secrets, or anything else that can plausibly extract. And there's different characters. One's an artist, one's fascinated with pornography, one's an underground entrepreneur who wants to turn his parents' garage into a nightclub, and George just kind of goes through all these people, and it's different chapters of George experiencing different people. And the first few pages started off quite innocent, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a lovely detailing of I don't know, the queer scene in a different time. And oh, it's not. I didn't do my research, and it's literally anti-porn, and if you don't know what that means, it means it's written so disgustingly that it's meant to turn you off. And I did my research, and this author apparently, when he'd write his sex scenes, if he got turned on, dare I say, he would delete them and write them again. He wanted to write sex scenes, queer sex scenes, so disgusting that people would feel physically sick when reading them, to turn people off having that experience. It was a lot, and I read this in public. I was constantly worried of people checking over my shoulder because there's sex scenes that involve poop and whatnot, not as an accident, as a very intentional thing. I hope I'm allowed to say this on a monetized YouTube video. It's still brilliant, don't get me wrong. It's very body horror and very intense, but it is that way to symbolize the realities of being queer and having this kind of lack of care for your body or yourself. And it is unflinching and so daring, and after almost 2 decades, it's a provocative classic that assaults the senses as it engages the mind. It really does insult the senses, oh my god. The writing style reminded me a lot of William S. Burroughs and Bret Easton Ellis. I was physically recoiling at some of the sex scenes in this, but some of the lines were so profound. Oh my god, there's this, as you can see, I've dogged a lot of pages and highlighted a lot of things, because in between these repulsive sex scenes, intentionally repulsive sex scenes, there are profound journal entries from the protagonist that detail what it's like to be young and not care about anything. And oh my god, this is a very multi-dimensional read, and I do recommend it ultimately, but for the brave-hearted. The next book that I read, going back onto this crazy little mind map, I should say, is Andy Warhol's Philosophies of Andy Warhol's, and that's because this is one that I actually meant to pick up when I picked up Popism, but I got confused and thought there was only one, and so I picked that up, and then this was the one that I was meant to pick up because this is the one that was referenced in The Lonely City by Olivia Lang. I feel like I need a wand and like pointing to a red string going between all maps or something. You know how those YouTubers do that? I feel like I need to do that for my monthly reads. Anyway, I read this in one sitting yesterday because I got my hair done. I got my hair done, by the way. I read this in one sitting yesterday. It's not that long, don't worry, and I was there for hours. I enjoyed this less than Popism because it was less about the scene and more just about Andy. And he can yap about himself, that's for sure. He loves to yap about himself and his philosophies and his life. But I liked Popism because it involves the entire scene and really interesting people and that kind of thing. But there was some interesting things in here, don't get me wrong, but I think I might be a bit Andied out, dare I say. That is it. That is the 8 books that I read in January. A little bit in December, but finished in January. I think I might be reading less in February. I'll try and do this again in February, but I might be reading less in February because I do have a very busy February with my event and everything. I haven't watched many films this month, I will say, because I have been focusing on my projects and reading, but let's have a look. Okay, and I lied. In January, I watched 5 films. The first film is Mulholland Drive. Oh, if you've seen this, you know what I'm talking about when I say I was baffled. And I had to go straight to reviews and Google what the hell it meant. And then once I knew what it meant, I was like, oh, genius. That's genius. That's absolutely genius. How the hell did he do that? That is genius. And then I remember we walked out of the cinema because I saw it in central London in Soho at nighttime. And I walked out of the cinema and it was all bright neon lights flashing and various people doing their thing in the streets in Soho, and I felt like I walked out of the film into the film, and I got a little bit scared and thought that I was hallucinating for a second, because that shows how well the film's done. I'm getting blurbs up on my phone. The film is about an actress longing to be a star, a woman searching for herself, and both worlds will collide on Mulholland Drive. It's an interesting kind of character study and relationship study between these two women, and you are left questioning what the hell's real and what's not real and what happened, and did I just guess that and did I make that up? It makes viewers feel like they're going mad, and I thought that this was just me. Then I read reviews and realized it's everyone who's watched this film. I loved it, and I would definitely want to watch it again knowing what I know now. The next film that I watched was going back to Olivia Laing, Lonely City, and Andy Warhol's Diaries. See how everything I do informs everything. It's a very delicate roadmap. I watched Basquiat's biopic, and that was interesting. It was kind of camp as well because David Bowie played Andy Warhol in it. Basquiat, I'm probably saying that wrong, I'm so sorry if I am. Basquiat was an artist in the 80s, I think was his peak. I might be lying about that, but I'm pretty sure in the early 80s was when he got discovered and rose to fame. He unfortunately lost his battle to addiction as well. Andy Warhol kind of mentored him a bit, took him under his wing and tried to help him, but also in this weird possessive way that was like, this is my scene, you do it with me or you don't do it. But also in a wholesome way. It's interesting to analyze from different perspectives. But this is his biopic and his life story as a young black artist in America in the 80s when race was stifled. I mean, I say when. It's as if anything's changed. But it is fascinating because he started off as a graffiti artist and then he was discovered and rose to fame so quickly. But people kind of penned him as Andy Warhol's little toy, little puppet kind of thing. Like this charity case almost, even though he was extremely, incredibly talented. He was a genius of his time. The biopic was alright. My favorite part about the biopic was David Bowie playing Andy Warhol. That was camp. That was so camp. It was so funny. I couldn't stop laughing. The accent was so bad. Every time that David Bowie would come into frame, it could be a gut-wrenching scene with Basquiat and I would start giggling because David Bowie walked into the frame with a little Andy Warhol wig on and did his little pose and did a little New York accent. That was an interesting experience. The next film that I watched was Poor Things. And I don't even need to say what that is because you know what it is, and it was insane. I've never been so stimulated and enthralled the entire time watching a 3-hour film, almost 3 hours, because usually by the 1 hour mark I'm mentally like, okay, intermission. But this was, the whole time I was leaning forward. You know, it's a good film when you're leaning forward. I was leaning forward like this, like, what's gonna happen next? The costume design, the set design, the scoring, the acting, the casting, the plot, all of it. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. There's a reason it's getting so much incredible attention as it is right now. It's this surreal story of this Frankenstein-esque situation, and it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I don't want to spoil it because it's so new, but if you haven't seen it yet, go see it. And if you have seen it, comment your thoughts because I would like to have dialogue about this. Then after that, the next film that I watched was The Favourite by the same director as Poor Things because everyone was saying he's brilliant and I haven't seen anything else, and so I thought, well, time to go on an absolute deep dive on this director if I loved that film so much. And so I did, and The Favourite was magnificent. The Favourite is about the close relationship between Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill in England in the 18th century, and they have this sapphic relationship that's threatened as the cousin of Sarah enters the scene and then she wants to be part of the sapphic relationship so she can grow and rise and have all the riches and the fame, and it's just this interesting kind of lesbian discourse, this interesting love triangle. It's in the 18th century Royal England no less, and it's funny and it's shocking and it's silly and it's sad and it's wonderful, and I really recommend that. And the next film that I watched after that was Ciao Manhattan from 1972. This was directed by David Weissman and John Palmer, and I didn't actually finish this because it was so hard to watch. It was straight up exploitation. This is Edie Sedgwick. This starred Edie Sedgwick, the memoir that I just brought up, again, the roadmap. But it stars her after she's losing herself to drugs, and it's really awful, and I didn't get more than half an hour in until I thought this is actually unethical of me to watch this. This should not exist. There's some people who review it and say that it's brilliant, that it's a time capsule, and that it tells things that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise, but I just think that it's pure exploitation and it's awful, and I don't recommend that film to anybody. The plot wasn't even good. There was no plot. The plot was just Edie Sedgwick with her breast augmented boobs out. Strange sentence that I just said. That is it. That's everything. That's all of it. Thank you for spending time with me, and thank you for caring about what I read and watched and all those kinds of things. This was fun. It's nice to be able to talk about the books as I've read them and not 6 months down the track and try and remember them. I hope that you had a lovely January and your February is going to be even better. I love you inordinately.